Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name's Karen Bowness. I'm the Marketing Manager here at MedTech, and I'll be your webinar moderator this afternoon. Today, we're here to talk to you about how you can protect your practice during the COVID-19 crisis. Now, we know that for some practices, it's a really challenging time. With us all in lockdown and many patients not getting the health care that they normally do, patient numbers are down, and that's going to impact revenue for many of you. And we wanted to help with some of these business issues, so we've asked the people that advise us to share their expertise with you. So I'd like to introduce our panel of experts. Firstly, we have Dinesh Naik, who's an accountant and partner at KPMG. Hi, Dinesh. Oh, I better unmute him.
Hi, Karen.
Hi. And then Kirsty McDonald, who's a lawyer and partner at Duncan Cottrell. Hi, Kirsty.
Hi, Karen.
And then our very own product and technology experts, Chrissy Patterson and Holly Hodgson. Hello, Chrissy and Holly.
Hi, Karen.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, our wonderful audience, for sharing your very busy day with us. There's lots to cover, so I'm not going to waffle on it anymore. Let's have a quick look at the agenda. We're going to do a little bit of housekeeping so that you all know how to use GoToWebinar and what to expect. Then I'm going to pass over to Dinesh, who's going to talk to you about the government's wage subsidy for around 10 minutes. Then we're going to hand over to Kirsty, who's going to talk to you about employment law and restructuring. That will be for about 40 minutes. Then we're going to finish up with Holly talking to us about how you can harness technology to get through this COVID crisis. And I know that many of you on the session today are our clients, so Holly's also got some tips for clients as well. And Chrissy will be sitting in ready to assist in our Q&A panel at the end, where we've got plenty of time to answer any questions that you have. And I really do encourage you to ask questions because we want you to get the most out of this session. And then we're hoping to close around 5:35. If we go a little bit over, that's fine. If you need to leave, not a problem, just exit. The session's being recorded and everyone will receive a copy of the webinar recording and also each of the presenters' slides about 3 hours after the session ends. So you'll get links to all of those and the recording so you can go back and watch at your leisure. So to make sure you can get the most out of today's session and ask us questions, I just wanted to explain a couple of the features of the GoToWebinar platform that we're using today. I'm hoping you have a webinar control panel on your right-hand side of your screen that looks a little bit like this. If you're on a phone, it might look a little bit different, but it'll be along these lines. Now, what I'm going to focus on is this grey box at the top. There's a couple of buttons. The first one is an arrow pointing to the right, or it may be pointing to the left. That allows you to minimise or maximise the control panel. So you just click on that to minimise it, and that will just leave you with the grey bar. Or if you want to maximise it, to ask us a question, you just click on it again. The option underneath is a microphone with a line through it, and that's just telling you that your microphone is muted. The button underneath is a background window, and that allows you to minimize or maximize your background window. I always suggest that you have that on maximize. That's the window that has our slides in it. If you can keep that on maximized, you'll be able to see everything really clearly. And the one underneath that is hand raising. Can I get you all to press that? That just shows me that you can hear me. No one's got any hands raising yet, have they? So if you can hear me, yes, thank you. Those that did press the hand raising button. And now if you have any questions for us, you just type them in here and press send. My job as the webinar moderator today is to answer questions as we go through or address any problems that you may be having with sound or display. And then at the end, I'll be managing the Q&A session as well. So without further ado, let's get started because there is so much content that our presenters have put together for you. I'd like to firstly introduce you to Dinesh Naik. Dinesh is a chartered accountant with over 28 years experience working in tax. 24 of those he's been with KPMG. He has considerable experience in advising large and growing New Zealand corporates in a variety of industries on a wide range of tax issues. Recently, Dinesh has been assisting a number of his clients with the New Zealand government's wage subsidy, which is what he's going to be talking to us about now. And I'm just going to hand over to him.
Thanks, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate that we are in unprecedented times. I hope you and all your families are safe and healthy during these uncertain times. Today, I'm going to cover the wage subsidies that have been announced by the government and administered by the Work and Income, which is part of the Ministry of Social Development. Before I talk about how the wage subsidy works, I just wanted to give you the policy background to this initiative. Both the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance said they are keen to keep all New Zealanders employed. This will mean that the recovery will be faster when business returns to normal. For this reason, the wage subsidy scheme is administered by Work and Income and not the IRD. The wage subsidy scheme is available to all employers, contractors, self-employed and sole traders, so long as you are operating in New Zealand. The subsidy is equal to $585 per week for full-time employees and $350 per week for employees that work less than 20 hours per week for a period of 12 weeks. This means each employer will be entitled to approximately $7,000 per full-time employee. The subsidy is paid in one lump sum payment for the entire 12-week period. There is no cap on the subsidy. Originally, there was a cap of $150,000 per employer, but this has been removed. Until the 6th of April, over 1 million workers have received the subsidy. This represents approximately 40% of the workforce. So far, over $6 billion has been paid to date, but this is expected to increase to $12 billion. Is there any other government assistance available? In addition to the wage subsidy scheme, the government also introduced a leave payment scheme. However, this was disestablished on the 27th of March. The government has now introduced an essential workers leave support scheme for essential businesses. I will cover this scheme later in my presentation. So what are the eligibility requirements for the wage subsidy scheme? There are 4 key requirements to access the scheme. The first requirement is that your revenue or predicted revenue for any month from January 2020 to June 2020 is 30% less than the same month last year. For example, if your practice had revenue of $100,000 in April 2019, but in April 2020, either the actual or predicted revenue was only $50,000, then your practice would meet this 30% requirement test. Please note that it is an actual or forecast revenue test. So if you are able to undertake a forecast for April and May 2020 to see if you would meet this requirement, you don't actually have to wait until the months of April and May end. The second requirement is that your practice must have implemented measures to manage the effects of the decline in revenue. This would include moving team members to reduced hours, using annual leave to make payments to employees, securing funding with your bank, talking to your landlord or accountant, preparing a cash flow statement to demonstrate impacts on your practice. The third requirement is that you must commit on best endeavours basis to paying your employees 80% of their normal income for the 12-week subsidised period. I'll talk more about this requirement later. In the event you cannot pay your employees 80% of their normal income, you must pass on the full subsidy to them. Are new businesses eligible for the wage subsidy scheme? If your practice has just started this year, then you would not have a 2019 month to prove a 30% decline in revenue. In such a case, you can pick a relevant period in 2020. For example, March 2020 compared to January 2020 to see if your practice meets the 30% decline in revenue requirement. So what does making best endeavours to pay employees 80% of their normal income mean? When the wage subsidy was first introduced, employers had to commit to pay employees 80% of their normal income for the full 12-week subsidised period. This created issues for some businesses, as while they intended to pay this amount to their employees for the 12-week period, due to uncertain times, they could not commit to it. For this reason, the best endeavours test was introduced. So if at the time of the application, you had to have the best endeavours to pay your employees 80% of their normal salary for the subsidised period of 12 weeks. If, however, after 6 weeks, your business had deteriorated further and you could not pay employees 80% of their normal salary, so long as you passed on the amount of the subsidy to the employees, you would then meet this requirement. For example, if after 6 weeks from receiving the wage subsidy, you could no longer pay 80% of your employee, 80% to the employees of their normal salary, and you reduced it to say 60%, so long as you paid the wage subsidy amount to the employees, then that would be fine. If the employee ordinarily receives less than the wage subsidy, for example, part-timers, you only need to commit to continue paying the ordinary amount that they would already receive. However, any excess subsidy amount for this employee should be used to top up amounts paid to other employees. The application form asks whether employee consent has to be obtained. Do I need employee consent, therefore, before making the application? As a national emergency has been declared, the Privacy Commissioner has advised that employee consent is not required. However, best practice would suggest you should get consent from your employees to provide their details for their application. Please note that employment agreements may vary this consent requirement. How is the wage subsidy taxed? When wage subsidy payments are not taxable to the employer and are not deductible when paid to the employees, this would result in a net nil position for income tax purposes. Please note that the payments to employees remain subject to PAYE, KiwiSaver, and other relevant deductions. GST is not payable on receipt of the subsidies. Will Work and Income Ministry of Social Development audit the claims? The government has advised that this scheme is a high trust model. This means that there is little front-end checking before payments are made. However, the government has announced a verification program. Therefore, you should prepare all documentation as if you were going to get audited about your application in the future at the time of making your application. So what documentation should be prepared to support your claim? The following areas should be documented to support your claim, and this is probably best practice. First is reports on how the 30% decline in revenue requirement has been met, especially if you are forecasting a decline. Steps you have taken to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on your business or practice. Why you consider you are able to meet the requirement to pay your employees 80% of their normal salary. Documents to show you've passed on the subsidy to employees if you are unable to maintain the 80% payment requirement. So how do you make an application? The application is very straightforward. The details are on this slide, which you'll get later on tonight. I've included the various links to the forms. The key information is the names of the employees, their date of birth, and their ID numbers. So how is Work and Income processing the applications? Work and Income have said that they will aim to process all applications within 2 to 5 working days. We understand that due to recent volumes, claims are taking longer than that. As the slide is slightly out of date, as I've said earlier, the latest figures show that over 1 million workers have received the subsidy, and the cost is over $6 billion to date. So what is the Essential Workers Leave Support Scheme? This scheme is available to essential businesses, to employees who cannot work at home because the Ministry of Health recommends they stay at home due to an underlying health condition they have, or they have COVID-19, or are caring for someone with COVID-19 or an underlying health condition, or they are required to self-isolate. Payment rates are the same as for the wage subsidy scheme. It is paid as a lump sum and covers 4 weeks per employee. You can apply again for a further 4 weeks. I've included a link to the forms on the slide. Has the IOD provided any relief on tax filings and payments due? On the 25th of March, the IOD issued a statement that they would waive late payment penalties and interest for tax payments due if businesses could not make the payments for their PAYE, GST or income tax due to COVID-19. We strongly recommend that businesses continue to pay their PAYE, as this is in essence money that belongs to the employees, and historically the IOD have not been impressed with the businesses that have not paid over their PAYE that has been deducted. If you're not able to pay your GST or income tax, we recommend you still file the required return due and contact the IOD advising that you will not be making payment and the reasons for non-payment. They are likely to then contact you and arrange an instalment arrangement, hopefully remit all the interest and penalties. The IOD have also extended the due date for filing of returns that were due on the 31st of March 2020 until the 31st of May 2020. Well, that is it from me. Back to you, Karen.
Thanks so much, Dinesh. Lots of information there. Oops, I'm just grabbing that screen back. Now I'm really happy to be able to be passing over to Kirsty McDonald. Kirsty is a partner at Duncan Cottrell's Auckland office, specialising in employment and health and safety law. She advises employers across a broad range of sectors, including education, manufacturing, construction, professional services, warehousing and transportation. So welcome, Kirsty. I'm just passing you the screen over now.
Thank you, Karen, and good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate this is an incredibly difficult and stressful time for many businesses, and that includes medical practitioners, because you're all providing essential services and trying to manage your workforce, as well as experiencing what I understand is a decline in the number of patients who are coming to seek your services. So what I intend to cover today is your key legal obligations as employers during this time, as well as looking at options to reduce costs. And in the event you need to look at restructuring your practice, what are the legal considerations you need to be aware of? So firstly, if we turn to key employment obligations, those legal obligations stem from a range of legislation, including the Employment Relations Act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, the Holidays Act. There are also some privacy considerations, and of course, your own practice will have policies and you'll have employment agreements with your staff. Those are all relevant to the considerations that you need to work through. If we turn firstly to the Employment Relations Act, one of the key obligations that is critical at this time is the obligation of good faith. That underpins all that you do and underpins the employment relationship. And that is the obligation that parties must deal with each other in good faith, meaning they must be active and constructive in maintaining the employment relationship. Now more than ever, this is important because any step the practice takes may have an adverse effect on your employees. And some of the considerations of good faith are refraining from conduct which is likely to mislead or deceive, being active and constructive, communicative, where it's necessary, providing relevant information, allowing employees the opportunity to comment, and considering feedback you receive from those employees with an open mind. We'll come back to this obligation as we work through today because it does feature in a number of the points we'll talk about. Turning to the test for justification, this is the test under Section 103A of the Employment Relations Act. And the reason this is relevant is because if your practice is suffering to the extent that you end up needing to restructure and make employees redundant, if an employee challenges that decision and raises a claim of unjustified dismissal, you may find yourself needing to defend that decision in the Employment Relations Authority or Employment Court. And what the authority member or employment court judge is going to assess is whether your actions and the decisions you made were ones that a fair and reasonable employer could have made, could have done in all the circumstances. And obviously the circumstances at the moment are unprecedented and particularly challenging. But nonetheless, it's really important to keep in the back of your minds that test for the decisions that you work through and make. If we turn to the Health and Safety at Work Act, as medical practitioners operating clinics, you're all PCBUs, or persons conducting a business or undertaking. And therefore you have a primary obligation, so far as is reasonably practicable, to ensure the health and safety of workers. Now, what's reasonably practicable will vary from business to business and will depend on your practice, and it includes assessing risks and ensuring there are relevant controls in place. Some of those key health and safety features are being talked about regularly in the media by the Prime Minister. There's social distancing, there's ensuring workers have appropriate PPE. You'll all as medical practitioners be well aware of these requirements. For those who have employees working from home, it's also really important to have those employees turn their minds to their home workstations, and if there's any risks that present from working from home, and ensure that they have put some controls in place. It's also about regular communication, obviously, with employees and isolated working conditions for those who are from home. For those on this webinar today who are essential services, and I understand that most of you as medical practitioners are essential services, you'll also have workers, no doubt, who are vulnerable or a high risk that you need to manage through this time. And we'll speak a bit more about this during the course of the webinar, as there are some additional considerations for those. Relevant also to health and safety is that under the Health and Safety at Work Act, an employee is entitled to refuse to work if they have reasonable grounds to believe that reporting for work may expose them to serious harm. Now, this gives rise to a number of considerations, because a PCBU, or an employer, cannot treat an employee adversely because they have stopped work due to health and safety concerns. And it might be that the essential workers leave situation applies to some of those situations. But equally, an employee may refuse to work who doesn't fall within that bracket, and we'll come to that later, as it is important to consider how you'll respond to that and manage your legal obligations. So those are three of sort of the key legal considerations to keep in mind when working through how you're going to manage your workforce and what are your options moving forwards. And what we're going to turn to now is, what are some of those options for reducing costs? I understand that most clinicians and medical practices at the moment are struggling because the number of patients attending the practice has dropped away. We have a range of sectors who are struggling in a similar way, but slightly different situations. Some will have employees like yours who are essential services. Others will have employees who are locked out of their workplace, others working from home, some that they have work for, others which they don't. And the way in which we work through that is all slightly different. But there's two general themes to the advice that we provide. The first is, if an employee, let's use a retailer as an example, is locked out of their workplace, they're unable to attend their work premise, they're technically not really willing and able to work, and therefore not entitled to pay. Now, there are the wage subsidies and other things on top of that that are considerations. But for those like yourselves who are essential services, your employees are really willing and able to work, they can attend the workplace, and therefore that presents other complexities and considerations in terms of reducing costs. So if we look at what those options are, Dinesh has talked to you about the wage subsidy that is available, assuming that the practice meets the eligibility criteria. There is also the essential workers leave scheme for those who meet that criteria and who are unable to work. But there are a couple of other considerations that I want to take you through today. And one is the negotiation to reduce hours or remuneration, or both. And the other is using leave and discussing with employees the use of annual leave or unpaid leave. So we'll look at each of those in more detail. Firstly, because your employees as essential workers are really willing and able to work and can attend the workplace, broadly speaking, then any change to their remuneration or hours must be by agreement. So the first step is to reach out to your employees if you are needing to reduce payroll costs and explain the financial impact of COVID on the practice. Explain the steps the practice has already taken to strip out the non-wage related costs. And then explain the desire to keep, as many staff as you can, or all your staff, if at all possible, during this difficult time, and hopefully you will come out the other end of it. And ask those employees for their agreement to take a reduction in their remuneration. Typically at the moment, most employers are reaching out to employees to agree an 80% remuneration, so a 20% reduction. And interestingly, there's been widespread agreement on the most part to that proposal. And we've been providing letters where they would have a signature block at the end and return signed acceptance of that variation for a period of time. If employees don't agree to that proposal, then it might be that you look to leave, which we'll talk about shortly, and or restructuring, which we come to later. But if we look to the use of annual leave, there's been quite a lot of noise in the media about annual leave, and the Prime Minister's made it very clear you can't require the use of annual leave as a condition to getting the wage subsidy, or unlawfully require employees to take annual leave. The Holidays Act very much applies in this climate, and under the Holidays Act, first and foremost, an employer is expected to discuss leave with the employee and try and reach agreement. In the event agreement cannot be reached, then an employer may direct employees to use their annual leave or accrued annual leave balances on 14 days' notice. But once that annual leave is exhausted, the employee is entitled to return to work on full pay unless they've agreed otherwise. So it's important, if you are a practice that's struggling and you're looking at reducing costs, have a look at what those accrued annual leave entitlements are for each of your employees as a starting point. Because when you're reaching out to employees to perhaps take a reduction in remuneration or work, say, a 4-day working week at 80%, you may like to offer them the use of annual leave to top up that additional day before you then look to requiring them to take leave. So those are some of the options in terms of what the practice can look at to reduce costs. But if you've exhausted those options, and I note that some employers have tried to reduce costs to 80%, had agreement, and are now going back to their employees to seek a further reduction below that 80% level down to 60%. We'll have a chat about that as part of today, because yes, if you've applied for the wage subsidy, it's best efforts to pay at 80%. But for some businesses, there's an acknowledgement that they're simply not going to be able to continue to top up at 80%. So if you've exhausted all the options in reaching agreement, and the practice still needs to consider further action based on its financial position, then it does have the ability to consider restructuring. But there are some considerations to be aware of. If your practice has applied for the wage subsidy, the declaration changed after 4 p.m. on the 27th of March. So for those practices who applied for it before 4 p.m. on the 27th of March, the declaration that those practices made was that they would use best efforts or best endeavours to retain staff for the 12-week subsidy period. For those practices that applied for the wage subsidy after 4 p.m. on the 27th of March, the declaration was that that employer would retain staff for the 12-week period. Now, it doesn't mean that if a business simply cannot financially cope, that it can't restructure, but there are some differences in how we would recommend working through that restructure. And if the practice is applied after the 27th of March, it might be that the practice consults about a potential restructure during the 12-week period and even gives notice during the 12-week period, but potentially extends an employee's notice period so that they do remain employed for the 12-week. Or if they cannot do that, then we'll cover off what those obligations are. But if we turn to a standard restructuring process, just so that everyone's aware of what that entails, this is where that obligation that we talked about at the start, the obligation of good faith, comes into practice, as does the test of justification in the event you start this process and it ends with making an employee or multiple employees redundant. The first is to formulate a proposal or a business case. Now, it's critical to spend time getting this right because this is the roadmap for the consultation process. It's important to set out in that proposal what the practice is proposing to do and why, and provide any information that is relevant. And let's say if we use the example where before COVID-19, a practice had 3 receptionists at the practice, and due to significant drop-off in patients attending the practice, it appears like the need for a receptionist has dropped from 3 full-time roles to 1 role for the foreseeable future, because we don't know when and if this is going to sort of come right. So if that's the case, then the business case needs to set out what it's proposing to do, that it's got 3 full-time reception roles and it's looking and proposing that only 1 is needed. The reasons for that, potentially providing some data to show why that's the case. And if you've got 3 receptionists going to 1, it's also going to be important to consider how are you going to fairly look at each of those 3 and determine who's going to be redundant. So what are the draft selection criteria you would need to include in that business case and to provide to those employees feedback? Then the next step is to consult with those potentially affected employees, those 3 receptionists, on both the proposal itself and the draft selection criteria that the business will use if the decision is to proceed. Then it's reaching a decision, applying those selection criteria, considering if there's any possible redeployment, which in this climate is unlikely to be, but it is important to consider that. Then applying those selection criteria and consulting with those receptionists about their scores, who potentially is at risk of redundancy of the 3, who are the 2 that have scored the lowest, and give them an opportunity to provide any final feedback before that decision is made. And then, of course, it's notice of termination on the grounds of redundancy. At law, there is no statutory requirement to pay redundancy compensation, so any redundancy compensation will be limited to that is set out in the individual employment agreement. But that's the broad process when restructuring. If we turn to COVID-19 specific restructuring, that's where it's going to be important to ensure that the business has genuine reasons for its restructuring, as well as carries out the process in a fair and reasonable manner. Coming back to that test for justification, test needs to be that the decision is one a fair and reasonable employer could make in all the circumstances. So you will need to be able to demonstrate that you've taken, as per the declaration you made for the wage subsidy, you've taken a lot of steps to try and retain staff before you get to the point of restructuring and making redundancies. If a downturn in patients or your financial position is relevant to the decision, then it will be important to provide that information to the employees you consult with. The usual way we would run a consultation process would be typically face-to-face meetings. And of course, during this current climate, it might be that some of your staff who are potentially affected might well be on essential workers leave. Some may be working from home, some may be in the practice, but it's going to be important to think through how you reach those staff and how you ensure you comply with your obligations, such as giving them an opportunity to give feedback. Is that going to be over the phone? Is it going to be over video conferencing? They need the opportunity to take advice. It may well be that one of your receptionists wants their legal representative to join that feedback Skype call. So it's just thinking through, in this climate, what do you need to do to ensure you're still complying with those obligations but being fair and reasonable in the circumstances. We're often as well seeing that the usual time frame, which would typically be longer, is much shorter due to the financial position that businesses are in and the need to move quite quickly, and even the way in which this is evolving quite quickly. Because of the declaration around the wage subsidy and also the essential workers leave, it's going to be really important before reaching any final decisions on redundancies, as I've said, to consider anything you can get agreement to, the use of annual leave, potentially the use of unpaid leave, obviously if there's any trial periods that are in the employment agreement, but probably most relevant is going to be taking into account employee responses to that proposal before coming to a decision. It could well be that your 3 receptionists that you're looking to disestablish and have 1 remaining role may come to you and say, look, we are prepared to job share 1 role between the 3 of us for the next 6 weeks. Now, if they come to you and put that proposal, it's going to be incredibly difficult for the practice to justify a termination when employees have been willing to accommodate and job share for that period of time. So those are the things to keep in mind. It's going to be really important because employees are going to be desperate to retain their roles during this time, given the job market's not going to be buoyant. And so they will, I expect, be coming back with propositions or ideas around how they can keep their employment. And it's certainly important to consider those. Then, of course, it's considering what, if any, redundancy compensation is due to those employees in their individual employment agreements. So that's a brief overview of the key legal obligations to consider, along with the options for reducing costs and what you need to consider if, failing all of those options, the business still needs to consider restructuring during this time. We've had a number of frequently asked questions from a range of sectors, and I've covered some of these in the slides that will follow, and I'm conscious many of you may have questions at the end. But of course, this is very much a broad application, and it may be that specific circumstances that are relevant to your business might have a slightly different approach. But generally speaking, I'll cover off some of these frequently asked questions. The first is, who can take essential workers leave? Now, Dinesh has covered essential workers leave, and being medical practitioners and clinicians, you'll be very clear on the guidance that the Ministry of Health has given as to who it considers at higher risk. And that's the 4th category on the screen. The workers who either have or a household member has a serious health condition which puts them at high risk. Those are the people, for example, that are over 70, people undergoing treatment for cancer and blood conditions, pregnant women, residents of aged care facilities, and those with serious respiratory diseases, heart conditions, or immunocompromised conditions. So if one of your workers has one of those conditions, then those are the ones who can take essential workers leave. Interestingly, the Ministry of Health is not requiring proof from you as an employer or proof from the employee that they have a serious health condition. Simply, the declaration is completed based on what the employee has told you as the employer. And there's more guidance in the links that Dinesh provided around that. What if an employee who we have received the subsidy for is made redundant before expiry of the 12-week period? So the money received in terms of the wage subsidy can continue to be paid to the employee as wages up until the termination date. And that may be partly the employee's notice period. If the wage subsidy was applied for after the 27th of March, then it may be that the practice considers elongating the notice period so that the employee does remain employed for the 12 weeks and continues receiving the subsidy and the top-up, whichever they've agreed to, or their full rem if they haven't agreed. And that subsidy, as I say, can cover part of the notice period, but it cannot be used for the payment of annual leave entitlements or redundancy compensation. If that employee finishes work before the 12-week period is up, then any remaining subsidy money that is left over is to be returned to MSD. Now, that is specifically in the case of redundancy. It's different if the employee voluntarily resigns. If they voluntarily resign, then the employer must notify MSD within 5 days, but the subsidy or the balance of the subsidy does not need to be repaid to MSD in the case of voluntary resignation, whereas it does in the event that the practice makes an employee redundant. We've got a lot of clients who are grappling with the fact that their employees are fit, ready, willing and able to work, but the employer doesn't have sufficient work for them. This is coming back to that scenario where employees are entitled to their full pay unless it's agreed otherwise. So it's about sitting down in good faith and talking with that employee and negotiating, ideally getting a written variation, negotiating a reduction in hours and remuneration which may keep the employee busy for longer, or negotiating a reduction when the work runs out, seeking agreement that leave will be used or potentially directing leave to be used. And if all of that fails, then it may be that you need to turn to what we just discussed in terms of a restructure proposal. When is my employee entitled to sick leave? We get a lot of questions around this, particularly where people early on during the COVID-19 situation were choosing to self-isolate in contrast to those who were required by the Ministry of Health to self-isolate. The reality is sick leave is for when an employee is sick or injured, or an employee's spouse, partner or dependent is sick or injured. Otherwise, it's at the employer's discretion. Now, there may be situations where an employer is prepared to agree to the use of sick leave, but it's certainly not an outright entitlement if the employee is not sick or looking after a sick dependent. So it's something to consider, but certainly, coming out of this, employees may well need their sick leave balances. So it's not an outright entitlement that employees can ask for sick leave and necessarily use sick leave unless it's for the situations as described on the screen. What if I need to close my practice? As an essential service, any decision to close is an economic one as opposed to an enforced one. As we've talked about, workers in an essential service are ready, willing and able to work, and therefore they're entitled to be paid, subject to an agreement otherwise. So if you're receiving the wage subsidy, then it's continuing to pay this to employees and ensuring that it's topped up to 80% where possible. And otherwise, it's agreeing what happens during that closing of the practice for that period of time. Agreeing leave arrangements or agreeing reduced remuneration arrangements, but it must be by agreement. My business is receiving the wage subsidy or the essential workers leave. Do I need to top up to 80%? Again, Dinesh has largely covered this. It is important to use best endeavours to top up to 80% of employees' normal pay. Where it's not sustainable, the government has indicated that it's enough to simply pass on the subsidy, but that is generally in the situation where employees are locked out of their workplaces, unable to work, not really willing and able to be paid. In the situation where an employee is still working or can work during the lockdown, then the employer will need to pay their normal pay at 100% unless they have agreed to a reduction. What if my employee refuses to attend work on health and safety grounds and isn't high risk or over 70? This is something that is cropping up. because while the Ministry of Health have given guidance on who is high risk, there are many employees, let's say one of your receptionists is 65, they're not 70 and they don't have an underlying health conditions, but they're feeling very anxious and incredibly unhappy about coming to work, and they don't want to come to work. What do? And you need to balance, on the one hand, that asking a worker to come to work when the practice is open is a reasonable instruction, with an employee's ability to refuse to attend work under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And of course, you do have a duty to ensure a safe workplace for employees. So in that situation, it's about, again, engaging in good faith with the employee. Is there an alternative role that they could do? For example, if the receptionist at 65 doesn't want to come to work in the reception role, is there something she could do in terms of administrative related functions elsewhere in the practice, or potentially from home? If not, then it may be that you take a hard line and say, well, you know, you're not really willing and able to work, so you're entitled to the wage subsidy and entitled to top that up with annual leave, etc., and you do your best to top it up to 80%. Or you might take the other view and think, well, it's 65, it seems reasonable, we'll allow you know, her to remain on the 80% that she's agreed to, or whatever has taken place. But those are the considerations. Strictly speaking, that employee wouldn't be entitled to the essential workers leave because they haven't met the criteria, but it is important to work through those concerns with the employee, see if you can come to some alternative arrangement, or if not, probably best to take advice at the time and work out, is it one that you could take that harder line with, or is it not? Finally, what do I do if my employees don't have any annual leave as they've used it up over the Christmas close down? This is something that the practice might need to consider if it had a close down over Christmas, because a lot of employees have taken a good couple of weeks of accrued annual leave. So if you're looking at that annual leave balances and they don't have a lot of annual leave, you may consider implementing alternative leave. It might be unpaid, or you could agree to allow employees to take a certain amount of annual leave in advance. But ultimately, that's by agreement. You cannot direct employees on 14 days' notice to take annual leave in advance. It's only their entitlements. While we're talking about annual leave, it's cropped up recently on several occasions that if annual leave has already been booked and approved, can you still require the employee to take it? Now, the answer to that is you can still require them to take the annual leave, but a request to cancel it, you know, the previously approved leave, should be considered in good faith. The other question that's arisen over annual leave is, does annual leave accrue if employees have been stood down for a period? And the answer is yes, it will still be viewed as continuous service for the purposes of leave accruing. So that ends my session today. The key takeouts really are that for essential services, any change to hours or remuneration must be by agreement. It's really important to consider what options are available for the practice to reduce those costs and to try and seek that agreement in the first instance. And if, despite engaging in all of that with your workforce, you still can't financially continue with your workforce as it currently stands, then it may be that you consider restructuring and ultimately ensure that you take the appropriate steps to ensure you meet that test of justification. I'll now hand you back over to Karen.
Thank you so much for that, Kirsty. That was really informative. I'm going to pass you over to Holly now, who's our clinical product specialist, and she's going to share her expertise on how technology can help you to navigate these trying times. So thanks, Holly, are you there?
Thank you, Karen. Sorry, helps if I unmute myself. So thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar. Our focus is really just to support practices to provide safer and more efficient services for their patients and their practices. Oh, sorry, my slides. There we are. So there are a lot of challenges for everyone at the moment. I won't list them all, but mainly we are all working towards limiting the spread of COVID-19. We're also having to follow a lot of guidelines and recommendations being set by the Ministry of Health. We also need to manage our patients' expectations, which is quite difficult in normal circumstances, let alone in trying times like this. And also continue business as usual, meeting the clinical needs of both chronically and acutely unwell patients. One of the top challenges logistically for us all is managing social distance while assisting patients in the practice. So this presentation will provide an overview of just some of our solutions and how you can incorporate these into your day-to-day practice. So we'll talk a little bit about telehealth video consultations. Also the pre-screening forms we have available in both MedTech 32 and Evolution PMSs. The bulk SMS functionality that we have. The red codes that we have specifically for COVID-19. And the New Zealand e-prescribing functionality. So first and foremost, you'll all be aware that the use of video consultations are on the rise. The benefits of this include minimising non-essential contact with patients and non-essential travel for patients to the medical centre, and also continuity of care for those that need to engage with their health practitioners. So with Manage My Health video consults, you can have consultations both scheduled and on demand. You as the provider can take directions on when video consultation slots are available and whether the patients can directly book into these or not. So this is an example of booking a video appointment through the mobile app. So you can see that the video icon indicates that there is a time slot available for a video consultation. Then you can choose the book appointment button and you'll get a confirmation pop-up. So this is showing you the process of seeing the appointment here that has been booked, starting the video consultation, and what that would look like on your screen. Users on Windows computers or Android devices can join a video consultation using Google Chrome, and users on Apple computers or devices can join using Safari. Our Manage My Health mobile app is available on both Android and iOS devices. It's simple to use and it's easy to access for everybody. So with video consultations, there are a few tips and tricks and things that are not issues in day-to-day practice when you have a face-to-face consultation with a patient. So to start off with, you need to make sure that you have a fit-for-purpose room that's got a plain background. So that can be quite important for a patient for a distraction level, but also the lighting to make sure that you're quite visible to the patient. If you can, make sure that there's no interruptions. So this should be dealt with exactly like a normal consultation. So either have a sign on your door or let people know that you are consulting with patients. You can also reassure the patient that this is a full consultation. With the exception of it not being face-to-face, everything should be as expected. Try to position your microphone to enhance audio quality for the patient. If you can use a headset, that often makes it sound a lot better for the person on the other end. And minimise background noise, shuffling papers, typing and tapping and that sort of thing. Please make sure you check the camera angle and proximity prior to starting the video consultation. Practice to make sure that you can see where and how you appear to the patient. And try, if you can, to maintain good eye contact. This is quite difficult because we naturally want to look at the person's face on the screen, but actually maintaining eye contact with them is looking at the webcam itself. And most importantly, privacy needs to be upheld no matter what format the consultation is in. So the basic rules of privacy with a video consultation is to make sure that you introduce all parties in the room if there's anyone else in there other than yourself. You need to reassure the patient of this privacy. If especially the patient is not used to video consultations, it's definitely something to discuss where you may not normally discuss that in a face-to-face consultation. And if you need to glance away, take notes, check, get some equipment, anything like that, it's quite important to explain to the patient what you're doing. That's very easy to assume when you're in a face-to-face consultation because they can see exactly what you're doing. In a video consultation, that's often those subtleties can be missed, and it's really important that you just talk through what you're doing to keep the patient nice and comfortable. With both METIC 32 and Evolution, there are a range of features that assist in screening, documenting and reporting COVID-19 cases. So the pre-screening tool is a really simple and effective prompted questionnaire for your front desk staff. So the form has got really straightforward questions. You go through and select yes, no, and then next to move to each question. I think there's about 4 questions, and that provides a recommendation at the end on whether the patient should have an appointment or not. So it's a fabulous resource for anyone in the clinic that's screening patients before booking their appointments. We know a lot of practices are screening their appointments on the phone before booking, allowing patients to come in. So this is a really useful tool for that. This is an example of the message that'll display if the patient answers yes to any of the questions. So it gives you a good link on information on how to self-isolate, but it also gives the Healthline phone numbers for the patient to call if they need to get any more details, or if they in fact need to notify of symptoms to the Ministry of Health. The next thing I will talk about is the bulk SMS functionality. So both METIC 32 and Evolution have this capability, which is already being utilised by a large number of practices, mainly to send important communications to the patients. So examples include changing your clinic hours or days that you're open, telling them about alternative appointment options like video consultations, notifying of normal or abnormal test results, and also advising of appointment screening measures such as, you know, the doctor or the nurse might come out to see you in the car park or whatever that might be for them. There are some key things to remember when you're using the bulk SMS functionality. So it's a fabulous tool, but there are some things that can trip you up if you're not aware of them. So firstly, you need to try and ensure that your text templates are only 159 characters or less. So that's one SMS. If you go over that, you're going to be sending 2 messages for every message that you're sending out to a patient. So for that reason, we suggest that you avoid using mail merge symbols where absolutely possible. So for example, if I have a template set up where I'm notifying the patients that due to COVID-19, our clinic hours have changed, we are no longer offering late night appointments or weekend appointments or whatever it may be. If you have hi patient name, mail merge symbol, my name might be 14 or 15 characters long in some case. So that might blow that message out to 2 texts without you even knowing it. So where possible, try not to use mail merge symbols. Also limiting which staff are able to send the messages from the clinic. So a lot of staff aren't aware that this is a paid for service. So they might, if they've got access to that functionality, use it as a really effective way to communicate directly to a patient without any sort of understanding that every time they send that message, it's costing and taking an SMS credit from your balance. And lastly, if you're going to send bulk notifications out to your enrolled patients or in any of your patients, it's a really good idea to have a plan around this, hopefully involving someone that's really comfortable with the SMS setup and functionality, so they can have a look at the message, the template, make sure it's not too long, make sure it's effective, and keeping those character numbers down as much as possible. It also avoids having double ups or sort of a practice bulk SMS being sent out, but then other people sending individuals where it's repeating the same information. So next we'll talk about the read codes that we've provided to assist in documenting confirmed, suspected and exposure to COVID-19. So these read codes can be reported on using the query builder in both METIC 32 and Evolution, but also in CBIT in Evolution. So the use of these read codes is really important, especially if at any stage you're required to provide information regarding COVID-19 in your practice or your patients to the ministry or anywhere where you need to analyse how this has impacted your business. So these read codes are available. You can search for them exactly how you search for normal read codes, and you can see on the screen here what they are. Hopefully everybody's aware that recently the Ministry of Health have updated their position on electronically signing prescriptions. So practices can now choose to activate the NZEPS within both METIC 32 or Evolution and email a barcoded prescription directly to the pharmacy. So we've anticipated this change and we're ready to guide and assist you on this process of how to incorporate it into your clinic's workflow. We're also going to be hosting a webinar next week, which will solely focus on NZEPS in METIC 32 and Evolution. We've also got a long list of resources available on our Insight customer portal, which can walk you through how to set up, whether you're an administrator or a prescriber, setting up dummy scripts and looking at the exempt prescribing as well. So for any more information on any of the modules that I've talked about or any other functionalities or products from METIC, please visit our Insight customer portal or contact us through our website www.meticglobal.com. I will hand back to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Holly. That was fantastic. Now, I've got quite a few questions for our panel of experts. So I'm going to unmute you all. For some reason, Kirsty, you're not unmuting. You can maybe try to unmute for me. Okay, so I'll ask Holly a couple of questions.
Sure.
Okay, will the e-prescribing only be, oh, someone's just asked a question which moved on my questions. Will the e-prescribing only be available for lockdown period or ongoing?
Chrissy, can you confirm that this functionality is going to be the same after lockdown?
Yep, so the e-prescribing capability in both METIC 32 and Evolution is available both now and after the lockdown period. The Ministry of Health waiver for signature exempt prescribing is currently only for the lockdown period, and as yet we haven't been advised if it will continue afterwards.
Okay, thank you for that. The next one is, do you have guidelines about what test results information we can put into a text?
I'm not sure if we've got guidelines on our customer portal. I might have to get you to verify that, Chrissy, but generally, if it's a negative result, that's appropriate to put in a text if you want to communicate that to the patient. If there's anything else to communicate to the patient, it's best to notify them, asking them to contact the clinic. It usually wouldn't be appropriate to put any results in a text itself. It's more just letting the patient know that you need to have a discussion with them.
Okay, thank you. Is there a plan to be able to filter by code in the address book to be able to email scripts?
I'll answer that one. At the moment, there is that's not on our roadmap to implement that capability. There are other ways to search in the address book, and we'll make some information available on the customer portal related to that. But that is a good idea, and I'll definitely have a look at implementing that in the software.
Okay, this one's for you again, Holly or Chrissy. Video consultations from home through MMH, is it possible?
Yes. So if you're using Manage My Health, you can access more information on this through the slides that Karen will send out at the end, but you can access that on either Windows or Apple devices through Google Chrome and Safari browsers.
Okay, here's another one from the same person. Practices have stopped being able to make MMH appointments. Is it possible to selectively allow flu vax appointments with nurse or video consult only as an alternative?
We might have to get, Chrissy, do you know the answer to that? Otherwise we can get Managed My Health support to answer.
No, you can do that. If they contact the Managed My Health support team, they will be able to assist with the setup of that.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's go to some employment-related ones. I have enough money in my personal, not business account to pay my employees. Does this mean I can't apply for the wage subsidy scheme?
That's almost one for Dinesh, Karen, but no, it's not about their personal accounts, about their business account, presumably. But Dinesh, you might have a view on that.
No, totally. So the key thing to get the wage subsidy is really the drop in 30% of the revenue from a month this year compared to a month last year. It doesn't talk anything about the ability to put your private money in. Obviously, one of the requirements is that you do take active measures to reduce your expenses or prepare your business due to the COVID-19 experience, which maybe you may have to lend money to your practice or talk to your bank or put more equity in. But it doesn't matter if you've got a whole lot of assets outside your practice. It doesn't actually stop you from getting the wage subsidy per se.
Okay, thank you. If a staff member chooses not to work during this time but doesn't meet the vulnerable criteria, etc., is this considered leave?
That's a good one. That was one of my slides actually, but basically we do get a lot of questions of this nature because I think there's a lot of people uncomfortable about going to work when they don't strictly meet those Ministry of Health guidelines. So it is balance. It's engaging with the employee around what their concern is in the first instance. Obviously balancing the obligations that the employee has to attend work with the Health and Safety Act, where they have a right to refuse work if it's an unsafe environment, and to the extent that you can ensure it's safe, or take reasonably practicable steps. If an employee is adamant they don't want to come to work because they consider it's unsafe, then is there an alternative role they can do? And if not, and they don't meet those criteria to get the essential workers leave, then assuming that the business has applied for the wage subsidy, that employee might be on the wage subsidy and then utilising its leave to top up, because the argument is there that that employee is no longer really willing and able to work because they're refusing to work, and arguably not on legitimate grounds.
Okay, thank you. This one is, can you just accept 4 weeks of the 12-week payment if we recover over the 30% level?
That's a very good question. Technically, if you do recover over the 30% level, you may have to pay some of that wage subsidy back. It's a very grey area.
Okay.
Yeah, that's consistent with my understanding as well, is that there may well be situations where employers apply for the subsidy and later realise that they didn't need it, all of it or part of it, and it's a repayment, but it is very grey. They haven't come up with that plan yet.
Okay. What happens if a worker was off sick before the lockdown and there is uncertainty about their ability to return to work?
That's a tricky one. If the employee is on sick leave and they are sick and they are still sick, then the usual employment law would apply in that they would use their sick leave balance, and if they're still sick and unable to work, then they potentially, when they run out of sick leave, may go on to unpaid leave, or the practice may consider special paid leave. But then if the reason for the illness and that they can't come back to work is because of an underlying condition that is one of those Ministry of Health considered, at high risk, and there is a chance that they may be able to qualify for the essential workers leave. So that's really just going to depend. It probably requires a bit more information.
Okay, thank you for that. Here's another one. We're a large clinic. Half of our doctors are contractors, half employees. For contractors, I presume I can negotiate reduced hours and then it's up to them to apply?
So contractors can apply for the wage subsidy, and
Yes.
and it's a case of if they're a true independent contractor, then it's as per the terms of the contract in regards to their hours or notice or termination of that or changes to that contract. But what we've been discussing over this webinar is an employer's obligation. So a contractor doesn't have access to those rights that an employee does under the employment legislation. So if they're a true independent contractor, that question will turn on what the terms of that independent contractor agreement are. And that contractor can apply for the wage subsidy if they are experiencing a 30% decline.
I was just going to add that, Kirsty. Thank you for doing that.
Team effort.
Okay.
Okay, here's a big one, a long one. Our urgent care clinic has had a marked downturn in attendances. Our doctors, who are part-time independent contractors, do not have enough work and are spending much of their day idle. Doctors are on high hourly rate and this is not sustainable. Can we legally reduce their agreed hours, say from 30 hours a week to 20 hours per week? Some of these contractors have health conditions that require them to avoid any contact with COVID-19 patients, so are not able to carry out their full duties and therefore are of much less use to our clinic.
That's one for Kirsty.
So that again comes back to, if they are genuine independent contractors, then what you can do with those contractors is going to turn on the terms and conditions of their independent contractor agreement. And contractors can, as I understand, apply for the essential workers leave, and therefore but that's probably a separate issue. So if they're contractors, it depends on the contract. For those that, if they were employees and there wasn't enough work to give them, that's coming back to the situation where you've got employees willing and able to work, but insufficient work to keep them busy, and they are entitled to be paid at their full rate unless agreed otherwise. So if they were employees, it would be about seeking agreement to change their hours and REM. But from what you've described in the question, they are independent contractors, and therefore it really does depend on what's in their contract.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think you answered this one, but I'll just ask it just in case I misheard you. Does the Essential Workers Leave Support Scheme apply to contractors?
My understanding is that it does. Dinesh, is that consistent with yours?
It is, exactly. It is. If you're an essential worker, you will qualify.
Okay.
Correct.
What are the Thank you. What are the responsibilities to contractors, i.e. people that work for the practice as a contractor?
Yes, and that's again, it's going to depend on the arrangements that have been made with those contractors and the terms and conditions of their contracts. But it may be that that clinicians and medical practices have a large book of contractors, and my only, I suppose, concern there is, are they genuine contractors or could they be considered employees? And that's a different, that's a question around the real nature of the relationship. But the responsibilities to employees are the ones we've worked through. Contractors are not governed by the Employment Relations Act and don't have those same access to those rights, and the obligations are not the same. So it really is as set out in the contract that they have signed with the practice, assuming that they are genuine independent contractors.
Okay, thank you.
But coming back, Karen, equally to the fact that contractors, like self-employed people and workers, can apply for those subsidies and for that essential workers leave. So it's really for those contractors to explore their options in terms of those subsidies.
Okay. Let's just give you a rest for a minute, and I'll have one for Holly. The video consultations in MMH, are these only for patients linked to this portal?
No. So next week we will be releasing an enhancement which allows a practice to send an SMS notification to a patient inviting them into a video consultation, and that patient doesn't have to be registered on the Manage My Health patient portal.
Okay, thank you. Here's one, I think, for Dinesh. Is it best practice to keep the wage subsidy amount in a separate bank account, or can it supplement cash flow?
Well, that's a great question. Obviously, you need to you'll get paid at lump sum by work and income, so 12 weeks worth. So you probably should keep it aside in a separate bank account and then use it each week as you are paying your employees.
Okay. Here's another one. Does the payment we got last week from the government count as revenue in looking at the 30% reduction in revenue?
So I'm just concerned about the nature of the payment last week. Do you have any details of that? Is it part of your ordinary? If it's part of your ordinary business, then potentially yes. If you normally receive those payments from the government.
Okay, thanks. Does the wage subsidy include KiwiSaver, or is the employer required to pay this in addition to the subsidy?
Yes, that's a very good question. So when you pay on the wage subsidy to the employees, you must continue to deduct KiwiSaver, ACC levies, PAYE and the like. And it seems to me, and Kirsty, I'm interested in your view on this, is that if the employer is then also required to pay KiwiSaver, then they are required to pay it on the wage subsidy amount as well.
Yes, I think that is correct.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, here we go. Another one for Kirsty. For staff that are essential workers, but due to health reasons, pregnant, household chronic illness, etc., are unable to attend work at the practice and not enough to do at home, do we still have to pay 100%? Probably only 20 to 25% work available for them to do. Subsidy plus hours work paid may not equal 80%. Hope that makes sense.
Yes, so on the one hand, where you've got employees that the practice doesn't have sufficient work for, those employees are really willing and able to work, and therefore if there's not enough work, any change to their hours or remuneration needs to be agreed. So it would be about consulting and getting agreement around a change. But separately, also relevant to that question is essential workers leave, because chronic illness or pregnancy and the like are listed on the Ministry of Health guidelines, and therefore it's likely that those employees will be eligible for the essential workers leave. Now, both the essential workers leave and the subsidy require the employer, to the best of their abilities, to top up to 80%. So it's really going to be about engaging with those staff. In the event that the practice cannot pay, it may be that it results in, and that employee cannot work because of their chronic condition, that they stay on the essential workers leave and potentially top up with annual leave and the like. But there is a risk that by just moving to that, they're in breach of not, getting agreement to any change in their hours and rem, particularly if they are still working. If they're working and they're available to work, then any reduced remuneration does require agreement.
Okay, thank you.
And just to add to that, Karen, if none of that's workable for the practice, then it's really about engaging with the employee about what viable options you do see as working for them and the practice, and trying to get their agreement to it. And in the event that can't work, then it's potentially looking at restructuring.
Okay. In a high growth practice, is it appropriate to estimate the 30% loss of revenue against, say, May last year, as May and June are very busy months?
Well, what the rules say is basically if you haven't been operating for 12 months, then you should be comparing this year's revenue to the equivalent month last year. It's pretty also uncertain what a high growth practice is and what that really means, and there's not a lot of guidance on it. But the true test is 30% revenue drop from one of the months this year to the equivalent month last year.
Mm-hmm. If in good faith you applied for the wage scheme and don't experience a 30% drop in revenue, what should you do?
Well, the technical answer is I think you need to pay the money back.
Mm-hmm. That's not
You
very
don't,
good news, is it?
well, you haven't met the requirements of the 30% drop in revenue.
Yes.
It's come up in a couple of situations where clients have said, oh, I think I'm going to get to 30, I'll apply for it, and then they realise they don't get it. There's two views on it. One, you may have to pay it back, or B, so long as you pass the subsidy on to the employees in good faith, and you thought at the time that you were going to see the 30% drop, that also limits your risk. So good documentation evidencing why you've applied for it and your forecast drop in revenue will also help mitigate any adverse things that may happen to you later on.
Okay, that's good. Is there a time frame to apply for wage subsidy? Does the application need to occur before lockdown, or can essential services apply later if they later calculate they have lost 30% revenue?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a bit undecided as well. All the references that sort of are on the Work and Income website and MSD website talk about Alert 4. So definitely while we're in Alert 4, you should apply for it. Not 100% sure if the alert gets dropped to 3, whether that means the scheme may stop. I know we've actually asked officials for that, but haven't had a view back. Kirsten, I don't know if you've heard anything on that issue.
No, I agree with what you've said. It's not really definitive. I've certainly got clients who are still applying for it now and in the upcoming days, but how long you can apply for, I'm not sure.
Yep. If in doubt, please apply straight away.
Yes.
While in Alert 4.
Definitely. If an employee does not want to work during the lockdown period and does not expect to be paid, do we have to pay them?
That's a good question. It depends. It depends on whether the business is applying for the wage subsidy. It depends on whether they would be applicable for any leave. Going back to the example I used earlier, if it wasn't an essential service and it was in lockdown and no employees could attend work, then arguably they're not entitled to be paid. But in this situation, I think we'd need more information to be able to answer that. There might be some risks that come with doing that. Having said that, you can generally agree a lot of things with employees, and if they're not working and they're not receiving pay and they're happy with that, it might be low risk to agree to that, but I think we'd need a bit more information.
Okay. Another one about sick leave. The worker is on sick leave and has an underlying condition which means that she cannot return to work, but we do not know if she'll ever be well enough to return to work at this point because of the underlying condition. She has used all of her sick leave and is using annual leave at present.
So that might be a case of looking like it's heading towards medical incapacity. If an employee is sick, has been sick for a prolonged period, out of the workforce for a prolonged period, it's about getting updated medical information about what the prognosis is for that employee's return to work. And in the event that's unclear or there's no certainty, it may be that a consultation process around medical incapacity is commenced. But that depends on how long this worker's been on sick leave for. It depends on a number of factors, including, their tenure, what the condition is, did it arise from work, what's the prognosis, all sorts of things. But that's more of a standard employment law type question.
Okay.
As opposed to a COVID related one, I think.
Yep. Okay. This is another good one. If a contractor receives the subsidy and they mostly work for your practice, then should they be offering to work for your practice at a reduced rate?
So coming back to contractors, if they've applied for the subsidy, then they've had to declare that they have either experienced or expect to experience a decline of 30%. And that will be personal, no doubt, to them. If they mostly work for your practice, that's their declaration and their business, I suppose, whether they have or haven't dropped the 30%. But the terms for which they offer their services to the practice really depend on the terms and conditions of that independent contractor arrangement. But there's certainly no requirement, because they've applied for the subsidy, that they must work at a reduced rate.
Okay, Thank you. GP practices got an extra payment to help with COVID costs. Is this income or a grant, therefore liability?
It's Tanisha. I'm not 100% sure, but generally most payments from the government would be a grant. So I probably just need to know a bit more about the nature of the payment, because I'm not obviously familiar with all the payments being made by the government at the moment. Sorry.
No problems. Next one is, there are two subsidies. I presume you can only have one or the other, i.e. we have already received the wage subsidy for all staff.
That is correct. You can't apply for the essential workers leave as well as the wage subsidy for the same employee. It's one or the other. Correct. The government's made that quite clear.
Okay, here's one for Holly. Make sure she's not nodding off. How do I make a video consult available for a patient to see when they go to book an MMH appointment? Putting MMHVC in the templates doesn't seem to be working. That might be one for us to refer to support, do you think?
Otherwise, Chrissy, can you comment on that one?
That one should be referred to the Management Health Support Team, and they can help with the setup and configuration of that.
Okie dokes, no worries. Lynn, I'll pass that query on to our MMH team and get someone to drop you an email about that. Referring to the enhancements to be released next week regarding video consults for patients not on MMH, will this be done from an icon within the MT32 toolbar, or do the doctors still need to log on to MMH?
Initially, that will be done through a button in the patient registration screen within the PMS system itself, so they will not have to log separately on to Manage My Health to do that.
Okay, thank you, Chrissy. We have applied for wage subsidy before the new Essential Workers Leave Support Scheme was announced. Have not yet received funds, but do we need to reapply for EWLS and repay the wage subsidy, even though amount will be the same?
I would keep pushing your application for the wage subsidy if the amounts are the same. I understand there is a delay. I've had a couple of clients saying they've been waiting a couple of weeks, but I understand since the early applications, they are now got people matching up the ID numbers of the employees with the ID system to make sure there's no fraud, etc. And I understand that's obviously causing a bit of a delay in processing the applications.
Okay. This one from Fiona said the government/PHO paid out some money to support GPs to help with the sudden and rapid changes to help set up telehealth, etc. This is not a normal payment, but is separate to the wage subsidy. Is this counted as revenue as it's not a normal income?
Sorry, Karen, what sort of income was it?
It was like an extra payment to help GPs set up for telehealth and that sort of thing.
And who was it paid by?
The government.
And they don't normally receive these sort of payments?
No, it's a one-off payment.
Well, then I would say that wouldn't be revenue. And is the payment, or is the payment used to, because my view is it's probably a subsidy provided by the government. I really need to understand the nature of those payments, sorry. And I'm not familiar with them, to be fair.
Okay, no problem. What about staff who have not started yet? Role filled about 3 weeks before lockdown. Can you defer their start or withdraw offer of employment as not enough work for them at this time and possibly going forward?
That's a really good question. My recommendation would be to discuss with them about deferring the start date and getting agreement to do that. If you can't get that agreement, though, it's not a case of, well, there's nothing to prevent you withdrawing the offer of employment, but it would probably be an unjustified dismissal, because if there's been offer and acceptance, then they are an employee intending to work. And therefore, if you don't get agreement to defer, you might look to get agreement that they start on reduced hours or reduced REM for a period of time, or potentially have to restructure the role because they are considered an employee for the purposes of the Act, because they have intending to work. So it's about probably trying to get agreement around a plan, whether it's a deferment or a minimum payment for some minimum hours for a period. I mean, they will probably be wanting to hold on to that offer of employment given the market, and therefore what's reasonable and what can be achievable. And if not, it may be a very short consultation process about the fact that the role is now surplus to requirements, and start that consultation processing and terminate on notice.
Mm-hmm.
Karen, it's Dinesh here. I was asked a question earlier along whether contractors could apply for the Essential Workers Leave Support Scheme. I just had a quick look on the Work and Income website, and it seems to only apply for employees. So I would recommend that if you're a contractor, you would then apply for the wage subsidy.
Sorry, Dinesh, I might have put you wrong there. I had thought it did, but that's helpful to know.
No, I just double checked. Look, I just double checked it now, but it seems to talk about employees and or self-employed businesses, but it doesn't seem to mention contractors. Whereas you should, in theory, a contractor that has a drop in 30% decline in revenue because the negotiated reduced rates or reduced hourly rate or reduced term should qualify for the wage subsidy.
Yeah, it is. You're right. It's and they've got that ability to apply for the wage subsidy, and it's one, not the other. Therefore, they've always got that mechanism available for the support.
Correct. Sorry, Karen.
Okay, next one. This one's a tricky one. I have to get my head around it while I try to read it out. I received the subsidy payments last week. Can I attribute the first subsidy payment to last week when we worked 1.5 days? Thereafter, we were in lockdown as a specialist practice, non-essential, in order to cover 100% pay for that week. Then moving forward, use the subsidy and pay up to 80% for future weeks. Did that make sense?
Yeah, that is tricky. I suppose I'll have a go first, Kirsty, and you can correct me. So the wage subsidy, when you get it, you need to keep employees employed for the 12-week period post getting the money. Or I'm not sure whether it's application or money, actually. Well, I think the key thing is so long as you're paying your employees at least 80% of their normal wage if you can, or passing on the wage subsidy to them, I wouldn't get too tight. And it's, I'm just not sure whether it's 12 weeks from the date of application or from the date you receive the money. I don't know if you have a view on that, Kirsty, sorry.
I think what that question is getting at is whether it's all very well to apply it in a week where completely locked down, pay the subsidy and top up to 80%. But in this particular week, in that first week when the lockdown commenced at midnight Wednesday, there were 3 working days. And I'm aware that some people have paid their employees at the full rate for those days, whether or not they worked them the full days. And others have taken the view that provided they're receiving payment for all the hours worked, even if the subsidy makes up part of that payment, they're not entitled to the subsidy plus the additional. So that's a tricky one, and I don't know that I have a firm view on what the correct answer is, sorry, to the person who's raised that question. I think there's risk potentially in, ultimately the subsidy is there to supplement the salary that is due to those people. So coming back to Dinesh's point, if you're passing on the subsidy and paying at least 80% to them, you're probably going to be in a low risk category. The risk is going to arise as to whether or not they should receive payment on top of that because they've worked 1.5 days.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next one, if an employee has a 71-year-old relative in their bubble but not living with them, are they entitled to leave?
The Ministry of Health has given guidance around high risk, and the essential workers leave relates to an employee who is at high risk or a household member is at high risk, and therefore, but they're in their bubble but not living with them. My gut sense is that's not a household member. Have you got a view on that, Dinesh, in terms of the requirements of that essential workers leave?
Yeah, well, that's right, because when I looked at the Ministry of Health website last night, the conditions that you had to qualify were either serious respiratory disease, serious heart condition, immunocompromised conditions, severe obesity, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, liver disease, or you come into contact with COVID-19. It doesn't really say have an age limit on it. So the first question is whether, unfortunately, the elderly person has one of those conditions. And then the bubble is defined as you can have a house outside yourself, outside your existing house. That could also be included in your bubble. But I think you'd have to have one of those, the elderly person would have to have one of those conditions as well, wouldn't they, Kirsty?
I understand that over 70s probably, my gut sense is if they're not living with them, yeah, that's a tough one, to be honest. I think you could go either way on the answer to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next question is, I have an employee on ACC and we are topping up wages. We don't have an ETA on return to work. Can we claim the wage subsidy?
So just say that again, sorry, Karen.
I have an employee on ACC. Is that how you say it? ACC?
Yep, yep.
And we are topping up wages. We don't have an ETA on return to work. Can we claim the wage subsidy?
I'm not 100% sure on that one. It just seems, because they are being paid by ACC, so I'd need to check that one, sorry. Unless Kirsty, you have a view on that?
No, I don't have a view on that.
No. My gut feel is probably no, because they're getting an ACC payment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Should the 30% drop in income be based on income singularly, or can you look at profit and loss, therefore taking into account increased costs over the period?
No, unfortunately, it's a gross revenue test. It's a gross income test. Expenses are ignored. So it's a purely decline in revenue, i.e. sales or practice fees, etc.
That was an easy one to answer then.
Yep.
Sorry, I'm just coming back to that earlier question about ACC, Karen. If the employer is only topping up the ACC, it's that 20% top up, and therefore potentially they would be profiting from the wage subsidy. So I'm not sure if it would necessarily apply, but I still don't have a firm view on it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. Our next one's for Chrissy or Holly. Do we have an easy guide to doing mail mergers available?
Not readily available at the moment, Karen, but we can create one and make it available on our customer portal.
Okay, no problem. Thank you for that. Let's have a look at, we're getting to the end of the question, so I'm just trying to see which ones we've answered. Okay, here's one. I received the wage subsidy this week, but I still had to pay full for employees that had reduced number of hours last week. Wages get paid on a Monday. How do I document this for accounting purposes? That's a Dinesh question.
Definitely.
Yeah, well, you generally, the wage subsidy is not taxable as part of the reimbursement, and then you get a deduction for the salary paid to the employee. What I'm not 100% sure what the person's asking is, well, if I applied last week, but I didn't receive the payment till this week, can I apply it retrospectively to last week's wage bill? And I'm not 100% sure on the answer to that, whether it's from when you get the money or from the date of application.
Okay, next one. A nurse normally works for 2 practices, one of which is with a cancer treatment centre. After the clinic has already applied for the wage subsidy, the nurse informs the clinic that she will only be allowed to work for 1 clinic due to the risk to the cancer patient. She chose to work for the cancer clinic. What does the clinic do with the subsidy received?
I'd say in that situation, they should, well, first of all, an employee can only claim it once, even if they work for 2 different employers. And that's why working income is matching up with ID numbers for employees to make sure they're only getting it once. So the clinic that's not paying her the wages, which is choosing not to work for them, in theory should give that money back.
Just on that, just to add another possible answer, is that if the nurse, she's not resigning, is she? She's just not working for the period. Because if she was resigning from that work, it would be different, because the clinic could keep the balance of any subsidy. It's not required to repay it. But I think you're right, Dinesh, because it's just a temporary non-working for that clinic, isn't it?
Yeah. Look, I would be, I know the law is quite clear on the redundancy thing, Kirsty. I'd be very nervous for employers keeping government subsidies. It's just not quite in the spirit of government subsidies. I appreciate if someone's made redundant, you get the money back, but you should use it to subsidise other employees rather than sort of profit from it, if you see what I'm saying.
Oh, that's absolutely the intention. So if employees resign, then there's the acceptance that the business can use that to help supplement and assist other employees. Sure. Absolutely.
That's fine.
But the whole intent behind that subsidy is to prevent employers from ideally making redundancies during that period and terminating employment. So if they are going to move to terminate, there is that requirement to pay it back. And that's just currently what's on, what the position is. It may change.
I see what you mean. Fair point.
Okay, here's another one for you, Dinesh. To calculate the gross revenue, would one take a week's income, let's say last Thursday to today, and average it for 4 weeks to compare to last year?
No, so if we're trying to, that practice is trying to forecast the revenue for April. If that gives a representative view of their April forecast, then fine. But generally, you'd be trying to work out what sort of revenue am I going to get for the rest of the month, and that could be based on your last week, if that's representative of the next 3 weeks, or it could be based on forward appointments that you think you're going to get. So it's a combination of all of the above. So it's a reasonable test saying if I had to forecast my revenue, I could look at last week to work out what my next 3 weeks would be. I'd also look at my forward appointments. I'd look at any other issues that could impact my practice, and then based on that, do a reasonable estimate of my revenue. I wouldn't just simply take last week's and multiply it by 3 or 4 in that situation.
Okay. An employee resigned effective April 9th to go travelling for a few months. In alert level 2, a variation of agreement was tabled but not agreed or signed before alert level 4. What is our position on keeping them on?
It would depends. I'm a little bit confused by the question. If they've resigned, presumably they've provided notice of resignation and they are finishing the practice. If not, if that resignation hasn't been, put forward, then they haven't resigned, in which case they are remaining. It would depend on what the variation was agreed with the employee. But if it hasn't been agreed, which sounds like it hasn't, then presumably the employee is remaining on. But if they had resigned effective the 9th of April, then they would finish the 9th of April.
Yeah, so she's saying they've changed their mind, so they're not going to go travelling now and they want to stay.
So if they've revoked their resignation. It's a bit like annual leave, I suppose, when you've approved it. It's a good question in terms of the potential there for the fact that they've given notice of resignation that they finish. Otherwise, to consult in good faith about what that employee remaining in the business on what terms will look like.
Okay. I think we might wind it up and leave it there. We've had a couple of questions around capitation and things that relate to Ministry of Health. We are trying to get someone from the ministry to talk to us, or someone that can answer those types of questions for you. So hopefully we'll be able to put another event on where we can get all of those types of questions answered. Failing that, we will refer them directly and get the questions answered directly for you. So sorry we can't answer those right now, but I think we have covered quite a bit, And Kirsty and Dinesh, you've been really helpful with all the information and very generous with your time. So thank you so much for that. What I did want to mention to everyone, when you exit, you'll be displayed with a survey, and that's designed to help us to improve these types of sessions and get a feel for the information that you'd like to know more about, especially during these uncertain times. And I'm sure, as you know, things change so quickly that things that, information that we delivered today may be out of date by 2 weeks' time or something. So if you could give us your feedback on the types of information you'd like to know more about, or the types of things you'd like to know more about, how can we help you, then please make a note in the survey when you're exiting. If you'd like more information from one of our speakers or one of our products, there's a line for each one of us in the exit survey. Just tick the box and leave me a number that you'd like to be contacted on. I think that's about it. I would just like to thank our speakers, Kirsty, Dinesh, Chrissy and Holly, for being so generous with their time and expertise. And I think lastly, on behalf of all of the speakers, we'd like to thank you, the people that are working at the front line of the health sector and keeping everyone in New Zealand healthy and safe. So thank you, everybody.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, that's fantastic.
Very challenging for all of you. And thank you for all your questions, most of which we could answer, and some of which were, some difficulties and challenges to some of those. So all the best with working through that with your workforce.
Yes, and stay fit and healthy, everyone, and look after yourselves.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Have a wonderful night. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks,
Bye.
Karen.
Good night.